Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance in the direction of the Kursk region, where they are slowly closing up the final Ukrainian possessions. However, some Ukrainian forces have been encircled within the town of Sucha and the surrounding areas. The Russians have captured these areas, but local areas with Ukrainian soldiers have been encircled and not captured, and therefore fighting continues within Sochi despite the Russian control over the town. The Russians also managed to advance in the eastern section of the front line south of Siversk, north of Soledar. The Russians also managed to advance here south of Pokrovsk in 3 different directions, negating Ukrainian counterattacks in the area, and the Russians continued advancing in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, with a Ukrainian counterattack in the Kupiansk section of the front line on the western bank of the Oskil river line. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have managed to advance to the northwest of Sucha, gaining control over several fortified positions, and some forest lines here to the northwest of the remaining parts of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. There are local pockets of resistance within Zaporizhzhia and Goncharovka, as well as Sucha itself, as well as in several areas here along the river line. The Ukrainian forces have been encircled completely in these areas as the Russians managed to bypass their positions and gain control over fortified positions here near Rubenshina, west of Sucha. The Russian forces are here fighting against the remaining Ukrainian forces that have been encircled. According to Donald Trump, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been encircled, but it's unlikely to be that many soldiers considering that the majority of the areas have been completely cut off. It is likely that it is numbering in the hundreds, while hundreds have reportedly been captured already by Russian soldiers. In that sense, it can be thousands since the start of the Russian counteroffensive, but it is likely currently that only a few hundred remains of the Ukrainian soldiers are within Sucha. The Russians are likely going to be finishing off those soldiers before they continue over the last part, which is unlikely to have any significant amount of Ukrainian soldiers within the final 2 towns here of Gogolevka and Oleshnia, as well as in the towns of Guevo and Gorenal here to the south. Both of these areas remaining are now less than 80 square kilometers remaining under Ukrainian control of the Kursk region. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line near Kupiansk, the Ukrainians managed to regain control over Fyholivka and push the Russians back from the forest lines to the east and to the west of the town as they continued their counterattacks along the western bank of the Oskil river line to try and regain some possessions and to destroy the Russian bridgehead across the river line. However, the Russians are fighting back against these Ukrainian counterattacks, both to the north of Kupiansk and on the western bank of the Oskil river line. In the eastern section of the front line, the Russians managed to enter the town of Vesyokivka, and this is combined with the recent advance within Sakoe Vensety, the first advances by the Russian forces in this area specifically since almost 2 years ago, when the Russians were fighting over Bakhmut. That is the last time the Russians were advancing in this area. The recent Russian advances here north of Chasiv Yar in the direction of Ryorivka, as well as some positional fighting in Oryovo, Vasilivka, and now with fighting also in Vesyokivka, Sakoe Vensety, and the capture of the remaining parts of Bilorivka, as well as areas north of Verkhnokamianske, shows that the Russians have restarted activity in the Siversk section of the front line, as well as the area here north of Chasiv Yar in general. This indicates that the Russians are planning on further offensive operations in the northern flank following the capture of Chasiv Yar, and this also likely indicates that the Russians are close to full capture of Chasiv Yar, to which the Russians can gain the upper hand. With the high ground under their control, the Russians would be able to start attacking the remaining Ukrainian towns alongside the Severodonetsk Canal going through the Donetsk region. The Russians would be then advancing alongside the canal to flank Siversk in its entirety, including its fortified positions. An offensive by the Russians along Vesyokivka towards Bondarne and then Nikiforivka would allow the Russians to then advance alongside the canal and combine their forces here to the northwest of Bakhmut and to flank the Ukrainian positions in the Siversk direction with the Severodonetsk river line in the northern flank. Russians then launched operations to take control over Zaporizhzhia and Toretsk to then cut off the Ukrainian forces in the Siberanki forest area to be able to completely encircle the Ukrainian forces within Siversk and in the Siversk section of the front line. This can break the stalemate that has been there since the Russian capture of Lysychansk, which happened in the summer of 2022, which means a almost 3-year-long stalemate here in the Siversk section of the front line could end with a Russian capture of Chasiv Yar, and this will also allow the Russians to start threatening Liman itself, which would allow them to start threatening the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line from the northern flank and to launch offensive operations towards Izium as well. Therefore, we can expect a lot of movement by the Russian forces in the western bank of the Uskar River line and in the Liman direction to attack Izium from the eastern and northern flanks. At the same time, the Russian capture of Chasiv Yar would not just allow the Russians to flank Siversk, but also allow them to gain control of the high ground here alongside the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, which will allow them to siege these cities from afar with their artillery positioned on the high ground as well as tanks and closer range weapons, will allow them to inflict heavy damage on any Ukrainian positions within these cities, which is the final defensive lines of the Ukrainians, as also the strongest defensive line of the Ukrainians within the Donetsk region. To the south of Pokrovsk, the Russians launched several counterattacks to regain control over 2 streets of the 3 streets of Uspinivka, regaining control of the eastern and central parts of the town and pushing the Ukrainians out to the western outskirts, reversing the situation for the Ukrainians. The Russians also managed to kick the Ukrainians out of Kotline in the northern parts, and in the eastern parts, the Russians regained the positions that they lost yesterday during the Ukrainian push to flank the Russian positions from the north and from the south in an attempt to encircle them. The Russians regained these positions and are now attempting to push the Ukrainians out of Shevchenko. So you see the area here southwest of Pokrovsk is a lot of back and forth between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, where the Ukrainians are attempting to encircle Russian forces and push them away to destroy this flanking maneuver on the western flank of Pokrovsk. However, the Russians have been able to hold on so far, and today they have managed to launch some counterattacks to regain some of the positions they've lost. If the Russians are able to reverse the situation, they'll be able to regain some important positions here south and west of Pokrovsk for further offensive operations alongside the fortified positions on the western flank of Pokrovsk and to further hit the Ukrainian supply lines in and out of the city. Further east in the direction of Toretsk, the Ukrainians have managed to regain some positions within the city on the northern and southern flanks as well as the western flanks of it. However, it is reported that the Russians have started some of their own counterattacks to regain some of these positions that they have lost and push the Ukrainians out of the city, which explains why the Ukrainian counterattacks have slowed down significantly, and this could indicate a turning point within the city of Toretsk where the Russians will be able to regain some positions. But we'll have to see over the next few days if the Russians are able to win over the momentum and kick the Ukrainians out of the city, or if the Ukrainians will be able to hold on and continue to push towards the apartment complex area and as well as the industrial zone in the central parts of the city. In the southern section of the front line, the Russians continued their operations towards Sherbaki and Mali Sherbaki, gaining control over the remaining fortified positions south of these towns and reaching the outskirts of them, which indicates the Russians are here looking to gain control over Sherbaki, Mali Sherbaki, Stepove, Lokove, and the remaining parts of Pyathatki in their operations here in the southwest of Oryhev. This could also indicate further offensive operations towards Kupiansk as well, aligning the front line with the Ukrainian defensive line to the north, and to open up the roads towards Novoandrivka and Oryhev here to the east. Therefore, this indicates that the Russians have started offensive operations in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, not a large-scale offensive, but simply some positional fighting to improve their positions for a future offensive. To conclude this video, we can make 3 conclusions. One is that the Russians are regaining the momentum in the eastern section of the front line following the Ukrainian large-scale counterattacks, which happened on the western flank of Pokrovsk within the city of Toretsk and in the general areas here in the Donetsk region, while the Russians have started offensive operations in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line, and there's continuous back and forth in the Kupiansk section of the front line, while the end of the Kursk region will happen within the next few days. The Russian positions continue improving day by day as they aim to gain full control over the Donetsk region within either this spring or summer season within these next 3 to 6 months. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.